So Lane, where did we leave off in our last adventure?
On towing.
Carroll Towing. Oh, that's exciting. And so what had happened in Carroll Towing? Had we sunk the barge? Actually, let's back up a step. Lisa, let's back up a step. And so, what are the elements of a negligence cause of action?
Duty, breach, injury, and cause.
Okay. And we are going to work through negligence when we articulate it. We're going to handle the cases as we handle the cases, but we're going to, as we articulate it, as we write it, we're going to do it the way that Cardozo does it. So what is our duty? What's the duty that we're going to be looking for? Yep.
If the eye of ordinary vigilance can see.
Okay, to refrain from those acts that the eye of ordinary vigilance, but we're going to change the name of the eye of ordinary vigilance to what? What kind of person?
A reasonable person.
Reasonable person. I told you about my reasonable person T-shirt, right? You didn't. We didn't share that. Okay, we'll have to share that at some point. And later, remind me that we need to talk about the reasonable person T-shirt. Okay, that the reasonable. Notice it is not the average person, right? It's the reasonable person. We'll talk later about why it isn't the average person. But to refrain from those acts, that the reasonable person should what? Should foresee posing an unreasonable risk of harm to Lisa what?
A particular interest of a particular person.
That is exactly right. To a particular interest of a particular person. Okay? And how do we breach that duty? How do we breach that duty? Alex, how do we breach that duty? This is so sad. I got so excited because everybody was here on this side of the room, and as I look over here, I suddenly see so many of my friends have abandoned me. It's creating this massive void. But fortunately, what is it that allows me to be able to continue in the face of so much disappointment? Lane, why am I able to continue?
Because I'm here.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. Okay, so I forget. Who was I talking to a minute ago? Oh, it was Alex. That's what I thought. Alex, so how do I breach that duty? I've got a duty to refrain from those acts that the reasonable person should foresee posing an unreasonable risk of harm. Got a duty to refrain from acting. How do I breach that duty?
Not by acting.
By acting. That's exactly right. to so act. I have a duty to refrain, right? I have a duty to refrain from driving my car blindfolded, right? Why do I have that duty? Because the reasonable person should foresee that action poses an unreasonable risk of harm to Elaine's physical well-being. So Alex, how would I breach that duty to refrain from driving my car blindfolded through the law school parking lot?
By driving your car.
That's exactly right. Right? So breach is going to take you how long? Pardon?
One sentence.
That's going to be one sentence. Right? If you find that you are writing for 15, 20, 25 minutes during the exam on breach, there is a profound problem in what you're doing. Okay, so we're going to be on the lookout, right? What was the kind of injury that was suffered in Paul's graph? What's the injury that's suffered in Paul's graph? Bob, what's the injury suffered in Paul's graph?
Scales fell on her, so physical injury.
Physical injury to her what?
Oh, to her person.
That's exactly right. So we know a physical injury to person will meet the injury requirement. In Carroll Towing, Elaine, the injury was to what?
The boat,
The boat and the flower. Okay? Both of which are what kind of interest?
property,
What kind of property? Real or personal?
person,
Personal. Okay. Physical injury to personal property. And in Vaughn versus, are we still holding out the possibility that we might get to Vaughn?
yeah.
Yes. Okay, good. Then, Rob, in Vaughn versus Menlove, the injury is to what?
Land.
That's right. So a physical injury to real property. Right? So when we get to injury, one of the things, as we're looking at the cases, we're going to take note of what kinds of injuries meet the injury requirement, what kinds of injuries do not meet the injury requirement. Okay? And then we're going to call the kind of causation that Cardozo is looking for direct cause. Right? And we're going to call it direct because it's not proximate. It's not what Andrews is looking for. Right? It's right now looks like direct or indirect, the same kind of causation that we saw last semester. But when we get to the end of the semester and we see how this cause is actually going to play out, it's going to turn out to be a little bit more restrictive than what we saw last semester. So to distinguish what we're looking for now from what we looked at last semester, to distinguish it from what Andrews would say proximate cause, we're going to call it direct cause. Most of the cases most of the negligence cases that you will read in your life are going to call it proximate cause. Okay, we're using the term direct just to say we've got a cause that Andrews talked about. We're going to call that proximate. That's where foreseeability is considered in cause. That's proximate cause, where foreseeability is considered in cause. We've got direct or indirect, any and all consequences, no matter how novel or extraordinary, which is what Cardozo said he was going to look for, but by the end of the semester we're going to see that that's really not exactly what we're going to be using. So we're going to introduce this label of direct cause. Okay? When you read cases in negligence, you're going to see the term proximate cause. The term is not nearly as important as what they mean by the term. right? When they say proximate cause, do they mean that they're going to be looking at foreseeability in cause, or are they not going to be looking at foreseeability in cause? Right? And you're going to see that by how they analyze the case. Okay. So now, I forget, Alex, why did we do this? This is our what?
Outline.
That is our outline of what?
Negligence.
For, are we outlining the law, or are we outlining something else? Coincidentally, we're outlining the law, but only because our outline of the law also becomes, Adrian, what? Exactly. Right? The outline of the law is the outline of your exam answer. Tells you step by step what you need to talk about. Okay, so now, Elaine, Carroll Towing, what element are we in Carroll Towing?
Sure.
4 possibilities.
Probably duty.
Probably duty. How do you know that it's duty?
Is it talking about the contributive negligence?
Well, that would tell us that it's duty, or that would tell us that we are not in negligence but are in contributory negligence. Affirmative defenses. What's that telling me? Yes, you do.
I didn't say I didn't know.
Good. I'm glad you didn't. We in negligence, contributory negligence.
I have contributive negligence here.
Then that must be
Affirmative defense.
that must be correct or incorrect.
Probably.
No, if you have it written, that is.
Correct.
That's why you wrote it.
That's right.
Right? I mean, you're not trying to deceive yourself. Okay, so we're in contributory negligence, right? Contributory negligence, though, as we talked about last time, is going to function exactly the same way that negligence functions. The only difference is now we're talking about the plaintiff's behavior and what duty the plaintiff had, not to some other person, but to him or herself. Right? A duty to refrain from those acts that the reasonable person should foresee posing an unreal risk of harm to a particular interest of him or herself. That's contributory negligence. Okay. So we know that within contributory negligence we're talking about duty because Elaine's first block of text on 153, the court says what?
Since there are occasions when every vessel will break from their moorings, and since if she does, she becomes a menace to those about her, the owner's duty, as in other similar situations, to provide against resulting injuries as a function of 3 variables.
That's exactly right. So we are in what? We are in duty, because they tell us we're in duty, right? And duty is going to be divided into 2 parts. What is the first thing that we have to figure out if we're going to apply this rule for duty? Duran, what's the first thing, as we have articulated the rule for duty, what is the first thing that we're going to have to figure out? What's the first thing you want to know about as you look at this rule for duty? The one on the board. What's the first thing? Or in your notes, either one.
I think it would be if they acted.
Huh?
If they acted.
He's got a duty to refrain from what acts? What acts do I have a duty to refrain from?
Acts that would pose a unreasonable risk of harm.
From whose perspective? Does it matter?
Yes.
It does matter. Whose perspective does it have to be from?
Reasonable person.
Reasonable person. So do we need to know who or what a reasonable person is before we can proceed in duty?
Probably.
Probably or yes?
Yes.
Yeah, right? Because what's that reasonable person got to do?
They basically have to foresee the risk.
Basically, or they have to foresee? Pardon?
They have to.
They have to foresee the risk. That's exactly right. So if the reasonable person is Superman or Supergirl, who never, to my knowledge, by the way, ever grew up to be Superwoman. I don't know why. Huh?
There's Wonder Woman.
There you go. They couldn't have the same last name. Okay. Huh?
But then there's Batwoman.
Well, they got crowded. There's too many. Right? So anyway, I don't know why you guys take me off on these tangents, but anyway, so we've got this reasonable, if the reasonable person were Superman, then as Superman is confronted with this guy trying to get on a train with the brown paper package tied up with string, what can he foresee?
Well, you can see the fireworks.
That's exactly right. He can see the fireworks. Right? Therefore, he can see that this interaction with this package, if he chooses to have it, has the potential to create Duran what? To whom? If that package has got fireworks on it and it is dangling above metal wheels going against metal rails, then if that package becomes dislodged, there's a real good chance that that package is going to what? It's going to explode. And if it explodes, then somebody who's only 20 or 30 feet away is going to be what? They might get injured. So if the reasonable person is Superman, what they can foresee in that situation is a danger to Mrs. Palsgraf. But if the reasonable person is more like, say, me, right, who can't read the textbook without glasses, right, then what? Can I foresee the danger to Mrs. Palsgraf? No. Right? So we're not going anywhere until we know what the reasonable person is like. Right? We got to know whose eyes we're working with. Okay? So that's going to be step one. But then, once we determine whose eyes, what person we're working with, and by the way, the t-shirt, are you guys sure I didn't tell you about the t-shirt? One of my classmates, what do you say, Kelly? I didn't.
No, I was saying definitely not.
Okay, so one of my classmates, we got onto negligence, first year in law school, and so he decided to be entrepreneurial, so he produced a whole bunch of t-shirts that were like a powder blue t-shirt, and then it had the big S symbol on it, and then on the back of the t-shirt it said, "I am not a reasonable man." So anyway, I don't know that any of you would buy one, and so therefore it probably would not have been nearly as successful now. But at the time it was very humorous. Who was I talking with? I forget. Michael. So now that we have the reasonable person, we got to figure out what that reasonable person can what if we're going to do duty.
Can foresee.
Can foresee. So that's going to be the second part of this, right? Should foresee posing an unreasonable risk of harm to a particular interest of a particular person. Okay. Now, Elaine, Carroll Towing, you said it was a duty case. Is it telling me about reasonable person, or is it telling me about foreseeability?
Foreseeability.
That's exactly what it's telling me about. It's telling me about foreseeability. right? So even though I said this is the first thing that you're going to have to do on an exam, foreseeability is the first thing that we're going to talk about. Okay? So now, what does it tell me, Elaine, about foreseeability? What does Carroll Towing tell me about foreseeability?
There's the three variables.
That's exactly right. There are three variables. Which are?
Probability of injury,
Probability of injury, which we are going to call what?
P,
P. Yep.
gravity of resulting injury,
Gravity of resulting injury. What the heck does that mean? Kelly, what? Gravity of resulting injury? Wicked. Anybody see Wicked?
Yeah.
Define gravity? I haven't seen it, but it's
Great.
on.
You
Yeah.
should see it.
Thank you.
The severity.
Severity of the injury, that's exactly right. And then, Elaine, what else? And well, actually, Kelly, what are we going to call the gravity of the resulting injury?
L.
L. For Lee?
Yes.
No. What is it for?
Loss.
Loss, that's exactly right. Okay, and then C is, Elaine, what?
burden of adequate precautions.
Burden of adequate precaution. Okay. And what am I going to do? How are those three variables, Rob, going to help me figure out whether there's a duty or not?
Based on the formula that they state,
And what is that formula?
if the burden is less than the probability times loss, then they are liable, or have a,
Then they have a duty to refrain. Notice that this is not a duty to do something, right? You don't have a duty to do something. Got to have an act, just like an intentional torts. Got to have an act. The duty is to refrain from doing something. You breach that duty by performing an act. So you always have to make sure that you have articulated the duty in terms of something that the person needed to do differently. Okay? So what does this actually mean? The burden has got to be less than the probability times the loss for something to be foreseeable. Caitlin, how does this really work? What are they telling me here? What does burden of adequate precaution mean? Let's start out with that. What did it mean in this case? What did it mean in Carroll Towing?
I'm not sure.
Next paragraph. What happens in the next paragraph to talk about this?
You want me to start at the top?
Sure.
Applied to the situation at bar, the likelihood that a barge will break from her fast and the damage she will do vary with the place and time.
Stop for a second. So what elements are we talking about now?
The probability of the injury,
And,
the gravity resulting from it.
okay. So what do they say about those? Probability and loss. What do they say about them here?
That it'll vary depending on the place and time.
Okay. So keep going.
For example, if a storm threatens, the danger is greater. So it is if she is in a crowded harbor where moored barges are constantly being shifted about. On the other hand, the barge must not.
Stop for a second. Caitlin, what does that mean to us? How do we use that? So I've got to evaluate probability and loss. And what he's telling me is that probability and loss are constantly doing what?
Changing
Depending on what?
other factors,
On what?
time or place. And
So say for example, I have a case, where a bargee was not on the barge at 2 o'clock in the morning. Is that precedent for Carroll Towing? Why not?
because this happened in the afternoon.
And therefore the probability of loss would be what?
Great. In your case or this case?
In the two cases, the probability of the loss will be what in those two cases?
Different?
Different. And if the probability is different, then you can't use that case to say you've got a duty to have a bargee on the boat. Right? The probability is going to be based on the circumstances that were presented to us in this situation. Okay, so go ahead. Caitlin, keep reading. Bless you.
On the other hand, the barge must not be the bargee's prison, even though he lives aboard. He must go ashore at times. We hold that it is not.
Stop for a second. What element are we on now?
His duty?
Burden, probability, or loss? What are we on?
The burden.
We're on the burden. That's exactly right. Okay, keep going.
We hold that it is not, in all cases, a sufficient answer to a bargee's absence without excuse during working hours that he has properly made fast his barge to appear when he leaves her. In the case at bar, the bargee left at 5 o'clock on the afternoon of January 3rd, and the flotilla
Mm-hmm.
broke away at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon of
It's
the
the boat.
following day. 21 hours afterwards, the bargee had been away all the time, and we hold that his fabricated story was affirmative evidence that he had no excuse for his absence. At the locus in...
Stop. Stop right there. What is the burden? How do we evaluate the burden of having the bargee on board the barge? What are we asking him to do? What are we asking the bargee to do differently?
that when he leaves, he fastens it to a pier.
It was fastened when he left. Based on what you read, Caitlin, how did this bargee mess up?
He was gone for too long.
How long was he gone?
21 hours.
Okay. Dentist appointment? Was it?
No.
How do you know it wasn't?
Well, it doesn't say it was.
Does it say what it was?
I don't think so.
How do you know that? What's it say? He gave a reason for his absence.
He had no excuse for his absence.
Oh. He had no excuse, right? He lied. Right? So what do they say? They're saying, what is the burden? What is the burden of refraining from being away from the barge without excuse for 21 hours. Anything else? When did this happen?
In January.
Okay. When else? Remember when I said midnight, 2 a.m.? You said, no, that's wrong.
Mm-hmm. It happened in the afternoon.
Oh. During business during afternoon hours in the midst of what? In the midst of a what? What's he say? Next sentence.
Full tide of war activity.
That's exactly right. What's the significance of this being in the midst of war activity? Harbor's going to be what? It's going to be busy. Fact that it's afternoon hours. It's going to make it, Courtney,
Darker soon?
the fact that it's getting darker soon. Difference between this and midnight.
There's more people.
One would think, that's right, it's going to be busier. The busier the harbor, the more likely that there could be what? That boat is tied up and it's the only thing there, and no human beings are going to be around for 21 hours. Do I have to stick around? No. Right? Question. How big of a burden is this on the bargee? You have a burden of refraining from ever leaving the barge. That barge can never be left alone. How big of a burden? Give me a number. Elaine, give me a number. Random. What's your favorite number? 3. 3 is a good number. What is 3? Okay, this is a 3. On a scale of 1 to 10, that's a 3. 10 being the highest. There's lots of bigger burdens in your life. Some barges are really nice to hang out on forever, right? So, if your mother calls and says, I am on the brink of dying from a terminal illness, and the only person who can save me is you. If you leave that barge, you've what? Lisa? You've breached your duty. Right? How high of a 3, big number, little number in that universe? You got to let your mom die. 3 pretty heavy burden?
Yeah.
That's right. I mean, we could get into the issue of whether you like your mom or not. That's for another class, another discussion. They teach family law here too. But, right, the barge is on fire. You leave it. You what? Lisa?
Oh, you're asking me? I leave it, oh yeah, I wouldn't leave it, but,
When you leave it, you breach the duty?
if the barge is on fire?
Barge is on fire. Does it
No,
care?
I'm not breaching my duty.
No. Does it care? Did you leave the barge?
I guess I do breach my duty.
Yeah, you do. Which is a heavier burden? This or that?
The second one
The
is,
second one, right?
it's an unreasonable burden.
Pardon?
It's an unreasonable burden.
Oh, so kind of you to volunteer that. Let's go back to the equation for a minute. If Cardozo had said the burden that we're going to use here is the burden of refraining from ever leaving the barge, does probability times loss outweigh that? No. Is that the burden he used?
No.
No. He said, what was the burden, Lisa?
He wanted the bargee to stay here during normal business hours.
And not to, well, actually, not even that. You just can't be away for how long?
21 hours straight.
Right? You can't be away for 21 hours and hit 3 o'clock in the afternoon when things are busy and not have any excuse. That's all I'm asking. I'll let you leave for 21 hours if you got an excuse. Right? Does that burden leave, or does that burden win or lose versus probability times loss?
It wins. I mean, it's less than.
That's right. So probability times loss is going to beat that burden. You're going to have a duty. Are both of those burdens that I could have used in this case? Can we crank the burden of never leaving the barge through that equation? Is it relevant to the problem? If that bargee had never left the barge, would we have had the barge go down? Michael, what do you think? If that bargee had not breached a duty, had stayed on that barge from the moment of his birth until the time of his death, right, would he have known how to save the flour and kept the boat from sinking? Could he have called 911, said, oh my gosh, got a hole in the hull?
Yeah, you could have alerted somebody.
Exactly! Right? So we could use that. It's relevant to this problem. Is it also relevant? Does he also solve the problem if, or actually let me frame it differently, did he cause the injury by leaving the barge without excuse for 21 hours during war activity in the prime time of the day? If he doesn't do that, does the barge survive? Michael, what do you think?
They said yeah. They said
That's right. So notice, is there only one behavior that can fit into this equation for any case? That is an audience participation question. True, false. Della, what do you think? Is there only one behavior that you can pick for any particular case, or are there multiple behaviors you might think to use? There's multiple. Right? So when it comes time to take the exam, Is there only one behavior that you can use with this equation? No. But are some better than others? Yes. What's the problem? What's the problem with the burden of refraining from leaving the barge even for a second? The burden of ever leaving the barge. What's the problem with that? It's too, why is it unreasonable? Because it's too, pardon?
It's too vague.
It's not too vague. It's pretty clear what it requires.
But ever? Like,
What's the problem with ever?
too much.
That's exactly right. I've picked a burden that's so big, I'm not going to get a duty. Who's picking the behavior we run through this equation? Who brings a lawsuit? If it's contributory negligence, right? If it's contributory negligence, the defendant is picking, right? Because he's arguing that the defendant or that the plaintiff was contributory negligent. Let me explain to you why the plaintiff is contributory negligent. Let me tell you the behavior he should have changed, right? Defendant is arguing that here's a behavior we should change. If it's negligence, who's picking the behavior that we crank through the equation? Duran. Plaintiff. Right? Plaintiff is going to argue, Your Honor, there is a behavior that I can pick out of the situation, and if I change it, there is no injury, and he had a duty. Right? So I've got to be able to look at all of the behaviors that I could use in burden, and I got to pick one that's sufficiently small that it gets outweighed by probability times loss. We all together? Right? Or Judge Hand. Boom. He went through all the possibilities and he found one. Should have been the plaintiff's attorney. Sorry about that. Should have been the plaintiff's attorney, but the plaintiff's attorney didn't know this equation till Hand made it up. Right? So Hand's on top of this. So anyway, he says, let's do this as a burden. Now I get a really teeny burden. And that burden is going to get outweighed by the probability times the loss. But Judge Hand, mere amateur. People get all excited. He makes a burden probability loss equation, puts in the opinion, solves the, This isn't Sherlock Holmes. I could have done this better than him. Right? We're trying to pick something that's a little burden, right? That's the idea. We want burden to be outweighed by probability and loss. So Alex, here's the deal. Post-it note. What is the burden of putting a post-it note on the barge before you leave? Bigger or smaller than the one Cardozo found, right? So you have a duty to refrain from leaving the barge without first putting a post-it note on it that says, I'm not here, be back. Right? Just stick it right on the side of the barge as you're leaving. Hard, easy?
Easy.
Very easy. Easier than refraining from being away for 24 hours. Yeah, it's easier than that. Bird in hand, what an amateur. What's the problem with picking that as my burden? Do we have a duty? Did he have a duty, Alex? Did he have a duty to refrain from leaving the barge without first putting the post-it note on it?
Yes.
Why? You're exactly right. Why?
Because if you didn't, then
Stop for a second. How do we determine when you have a duty?
through reasonable person, that's the variables.
Foreseeability, right? Probability of injury, right? Bad things can happen in the war effort, right? In the bay. Bad thing, that could be a novel. Bad things happening in the bay. Okay, so high probability. Loss, you lose your barge, you lose your cargo, that's a big loss. Right? What's the burden? All I'm asking the guy to do is when he leaves, do what?
Put a sticky note on.
Put a sticky note on the side of the boat. That's how big a burden is that?
Small burden.
Right? If 3 is refrain from leaving the barge at all, putting the sticky note on, Elaine, what are we talking here? 0.0001? Okay, we're talking tiny. Okay? Burden, probability of loss. Which side wins? Probability of loss or burden? Which is bigger?
The probability of loss.
That's exactly right. Did he have a duty? Did he breach it?
No, because he,
Stop for a second. Did he put the sticky note on?
yeah. That was his duty to put the sticky note.
He had a duty to put the sticky note on. Is there anything in the opinion that says that this guy put a sticky note on the boat before he left?
No,
Did he breach it?
yes.
Yeah. Did the company suffer a loss? Did that boat sink? Injury?
Yes.
Yeah. Cargo loss? Right? There's a loss. Is it an injury to something that we allow recovery for?
Yes.
Yes. Right? Physical injury, personal property.
Personal property.
Yeah. Is there liability? I went through all the elements, right? No, Alec, this is where you say, Professor Lee, you're being deceptive. You're trying to trap me. You only went through 3 of the elements.
You still have to get your cause.
I still have to get through cause. And to get through cause, even in Cardozo's universe, I have to be able to say what?
Yeah, but for relationship.
But for the failure to,
Stay on board.
no, but for the failure to put the,
Sticky note on.
that's right, but for the failure to put the sticky note on the side of the boat would not have sunk and the cargo wouldn't have been destroyed. Is that true? No. Why not? Because nobody would have what? The sticky note. April?
Oh, I've seen it.
No one would have seen it. It didn't make any difference at all. It's stupid. Right? What is the other parameter we need for what we pick in the burden? It's got to be small enough that it loses to probability and loss, but Janice, it's got to be big enough that we can consider it a what?
A reasonable expectation.
No, but what? What was Alex just talking about? It's got to be significant enough that it forms a what of the injury? Nope.
A burden.
Nope. You got all the letters around it, but not the one that you need. You got a D, you got a B. In between them is a,
The injury.
no, between D and B, alphabet.
C.
C. Element C. This happened at C. Oh, isn't it cool? Right? It's the symmetry of all this, right? This happened at C, and there's an element of negligence that starts with C, and that element is what, Janice? Cause. Right? It's got to be big enough. The behavior that we're focusing on for burden has got to be big enough that it can constitute a cause of the injury, but it's got to be small enough, non-intrusive enough that it loses to probability and loss. That's how you got to pick it. Right? So you get your exam, you see a fact situation, and there's a whole bunch of behaviors that you could change, a whole bunch of ways you could characterize what the defendant did wrong. And I don't care which one you pick, but it's got to be one that makes sense within those parameters. I'm picking something here that's credible on the cause side and credible on the burden side.
Could you repeat that sentence, please? Behavior for burden has to be big enough to constitute.
It's got to be significant enough that you can see that it is a cause. Right? Because notice what's going to happen is whatever burden is the burden of changing some behavior. That's what the burden stands for. The burden of changing some behavior that the defendant engaged in, or if it's contributory negligence that the plaintiff engaged in. What is the burden of refraining from that behavior that the defendant engaged in? And if probability and loss are bigger than however we designate that burden, then we're going to have a duty to refrain from that behavior. Right? So if we use this, you've got a duty to refrain from leaving the barge. If we use this, you've got a duty to refrain from being away from the barge without excuse for 21 hours during an afternoon in the midst of a war activity. And then we're going to see, do we have breach? Did he refrain from leaving the barge? No, he left the barge. Did he refrain from being away from the barge without excuse for 21 hours? No, he was away from it for 21 hours. Did he refrain from leaving without putting the sticky note on? No, he left without putting the sticky note on. Right? Duty and breach, all of those cases. But then we take those cases down to causation and we say, but for him leaving the barge, would the barge have sank and the cargo been lost? Yes. But for him leaving the barge without excuse for 21 hours during the afternoon in the midst of war activity, the barge wouldn't have been lost and the cargo wouldn't have lost. Yes. But for him leaving without first putting the sticky note on the side of the barge, the cargo would not have been lost. And Alex, the answer to that one is yes cause, no cause.
Yes, there would have been cause.
Oh, if I put a sticky note on, the boat doesn't sink. Unless it's a very buoyant sticky note. Right? Because April has already pointed out that nobody is going to what?
No one's gonna see it.
That's right. If they didn't check to see whether it was tied up, they're not going to check the sides of the boat for sticky notes. Right? Cause, no cause.
There is no cause.
There is no cause. It's too trivial. Yeah, it was small enough to create a duty, but it doesn't help me on cause. Right? So when I'm looking at that behavior that I want to use on my exam or I want to use in my complaint, I got to be sensitive to, does changing this behavior, the burden of changing this behavior, lose to probability and loss? Yeah, okay, then I can think about using it. It's a possibility. But now I take all the things that are possible because they lose to probability and loss, and now I got to say which of them also create a cause. Right? And if I find one that loses to if I find a behavior to be changed that loses to probability and loss but wins on causation, then I can bring a what? Then, Adrian, I can bring a what? A lawsuit. Under? Rhymes with leg? No, actually only one syllable rhymes with leg. Some of you were like, strict liability? No. What are we studying right now? What cause of action? Negligence. I can bring a lawsuit under negligence. Right? But I got to find that behavior. Okay? Questions? Good. Because now, let's take a look. One of the questions, right, so we see Carroll Towing, and they're putting this question of reasonable person foreseeing, right, they're putting that in duty. Okay, well, that was one of the things that we were going to look for, because there's still that argument from Cardozo to Andrews and Paul's graph, and some people want to listen to Andrews and put it in proximate cause, and some people want to put foreseeability and duty, so we're going to look for that. What was the other thing I said we're going to look for? Do they treat foreseeability as, Crystal, what kind of concept? realistically, there's two ways that we can, in fact, I'm positive there are two ways that we can view that concept of foreseeability. What are the two ways? What are the two ways? Wait till you're positive of what they are, and then really tell me.
I know there's a clue there.
There is.
I'm not
There's
picking
two
up on
clues.
it.
Huh?
I know there's a clue there, but I'm not picking up on it.
Andrew said foreseeability, proximate cause, Crystal, is a function of what? Forget what I was just talking about. Andrew said that the question of proximity, proximate, the question of foreseeability, the question of the extent of liability, all come down to a question of what? Not legal logic, but what? Ever listen to Beatles music?
Yes.
George, John, Ringo, who's missing? You invited this one. You're the one who said listen to Beatles music. George, John, Paul. Or George, John, Ringo. Who are we missing?
Paul.
Paul. You're walking down the street. You see McCartney. Right?
Yeah.
Okay? You're walking with a friend. You say, oh, that's who?
Paul McCartney.
That's Paul I.C. Right? It's a, excuse me. Everybody's a critic. Okay? Right? Andrew said proximate's all a question of policy. What did Cardozo say? No, this is about legal logic. Positivist realist. Okay? Carroll Towing. Foreseeability, Courtney, is what? Realist, positivist.
Real positivist.
Those are the two possibilities.
Positivist?
Why?
Because I got it wrong last class, and I just remember it was positivist.
Because he reduces this to what? Want to know what foreseeability is? All you got to do is use a what?
Policy?
No, it's not policy. What is that? What's Cardozo call it? Back to the 8th grade. What math did you... louder?
Algebra.
It's algebra. That's what he says. This is all algebra. You take the values, you crank them in the equation, you get an answer. Objective, subjective.
Subjective? Objective.
Those are the two possibilities. Math is supposed to be what kind of class when you're in the 8th grade? How many answers are there that are right? One. That is what? Objective, subjective. We all got to come to the same answer whether we like it or not. That is objective. Right? All right-thinking people can come up with the right answer. Come up with the wrong answer, you're wrong thinking. That's positive. Right? No policy here. No social policy deterrence, no fairness, no justice, no nothing. Right? Because it's algebra. Gulf refining. Positivist or realist? What happens in Gulf refining? Courtney, it's worth thinking about what happens in Gulf. What happens in Gulf refining?
There's an employee burned by a fire.
There is an employee burned by a fire.
Oh, I gotta find a page. Oh.
Oh,
Okay, so there was the employee burned by the fire.
yep.
And then there's the foreseeability test.
Yes. Right? We see that not. I mean, they're running all the same variables, right? And there's an argument, Courtney, about which of the variable. What's the loss? What's the loss here?
The injury?
The injury. What's the injury? That this poor guy got what?
Burned.
Got burned. How bad?
Pretty bad.
Pretty bad. Because
Of an explosion, right?
There, that's right. We have an industrial sized container of gasoline that blew up while he had his hand on it. Okay, we are talking big. Okay, burn. All right. So and the loss, right? Not every case, so you got to be on the lookout. Not every case is going to define loss in this way, but this is the way that we are going to define loss in our class. Loss is the injury that was suffered. It goes with our definition of duty, particular interest of a particular person. Cardozo's definition of duty, particular interest of a particular person. So what was the injury here? That's my loss. Right? Whatever the injury was here, that's what I'm going to put in loss. Okay? And then probability, Courtney, is what? So let's mark that. Right? So 1, 3, notice that is a number 1, 3 variables. A, probability. B, loss. C, burden. B1, loss, means actual injury suffered. Now there's an argument about the meaning of probability. Courtney, what's the reason that we have, now you're on the right page, what's the argument about the meaning of probability? Defendant says, wait a minute. This is not my fault. There's no way you could have foreseen this. Because why, Courtney? Why was there no way that this could have ever been foreseen?
Because that they wanted,
Why did the gas tank blow up?
it was old, right? And now.
Pardon?
It was like 9 years old, or it hadn't been used in a really long time.
Oh no, it had been used. Why, in fact, it had been used what?
It had been used so much that there was like something wrong with the cap.
What was wrong with the cap?
The threads. They like took all the, because from they were banging it with a hammer all the time, all the threads that held the cap on.
The threads had broken. Right? So these threads are now jagged. And so you take this metal cap with jagged threads, broken threads, and you screw it in to this threaded opening, and as you're running this jagged metal against the threads on the opening, what are you generating? You're generating sparks. And one of those sparks, Courtney, did what?
Fire.
It spark being the fire, yes. And that fire went where?
It caused the explosion.
Into the gas drum, where it ignited all the gas and it blew up. How could you have been so stupid, owner of the gas drum, who sent this thing out for this guy to use? And his answer was what? Whoa, wait a minute. Before you call me stupid, recognize that what? In all the life world knowledge of gas drumming, Kaylee, what?
Never happened.
It's never happened before. And therefore, to a reasonable person, Kaylee, the probability of it happening now was what?
None.
None. And if the probability is 0, what's probability times loss? 0. Doesn't matter that there's a huge loss. To a reasonable person's perspective, the probability would have been 0. And Courtney, the court said, what about that? Now you can turn the page. Court said, what about that? Actually, if you would already turn the page, then you can't turn the page.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, I got excited because okay. So, what does the court say about that?
That the proof was sufficient to show that that a person of ordinary prudence and mindfulness should have known.
Stop first. Why? They said, wait a minute, nope, you're wrong. Probability times loss outweighs the burden here. Because why? What, Courtney, does probability mean? Does it mean the probability as it would be perceived by a reasonable person? No, you know. What?
I don't really understand how they're saying this, but
Well, what are they saying? This is so exciting. What are they saying?
that they are liable. For
They
the-
are saying that they're liable because the probability beats the loss. Why?
Because you should have anticipated it.
Why? Read me the third paragraph from 140.
The test as respects foreseeability is not the balance of probabilities, but the existence in the situation in hand of some real likelihood of some damage and the
Stop. They define probability how?
likelihood of
The likelihood of damage. What does that mean? Does it mean what a reasonable person would think the likelihood of damage was?
No.
What's it mean?
It means if it's rational, if it's going to happen.
Stop for a second. What does it mean? The likelihood of so I don't have. Oh, I do have. Okay. That's all right. Okay, so heads, tails.
Tails.
What's the likelihood that it will be tails?
50%.
I'm one of those guys who's a tails believer. You know, tails always wins. I think it's like 75-80. What do you think? You sticking with 50?
I'll stick with 50.
Why?
Because it's.
Am I a reasonable person? Why don't you defer to my reasonable person vision? Don't help her, Kaylee. She got enough problems. She doesn't need bad influence. Yeah, I know what you would have said.
Because, I mean, mathematically, there's.
That's what probability, Courtney, are you looking at? You're exactly right. You are looking at what?
Math.
That's right. And what's the court looking at? What was the flaw in what I said? The defendant's argument was, wait a minute, this has never happened before. A reasonable person would have thought the probability of it happening was 0. And the court said, Courtney, what? We don't care what the reasonable person would think.
They don't care.
They don't care. What do they care about?
The likelihood.
Measured as a what that you keep saying?
Math.
That's right, as a mathematical probability. So on your exam, what are you going to look for? You going to look for what a reasonable person would have thought? Or are you going to look for what's the mathematical probability that's going wrong?
Mathematical probability.
That's exactly what you're going to look at. Courtney, just because this had never happened before, does that make the probability 0?
No.
No. Right? We know that there was a probability that it could happen because it what?
Happened.
It happened. That probability may have been infinitely small, but mathematically it still existed. Right? Probability. The mathematical likelihood. Right? And so why is it? Why is it that probability and loss wins? Probability, Courtney, is still what? In this case, the probability that's happening is still what?
Low?
It is still low. Never happened before. Probability is low that this could happen. This is a freaky thing. But the loss is what? High. It's huge. So you put those two things together and they beat burden. Now, burden is kind of a funny thing in this case, because we learned something about burden here. Burden has 2 parts. And the court's sneaky about this because they only tell you about one of them. All you got to do is fix the cap. You got to refrain from sending the drum out with a broken cap. The caps go $2.99 at Walmart. Right? That's the burden. What is the burden of refraining from sending this thing out with a broken cap? $2.99. The burden of refraining. Just fix the cap. But easier said than done. Why? Kaylee, why didn't the defendant fix the cap here?
We didn't expect it to explode.
He didn't expect it. The burden that was hard here was the burden to what?
To foresee it happening.
That's right, the burden to anticipate, the burden to expect. Right? There's two burdens that you have to look for. The burden of knowing to refrain, the burden of knowing to refrain, and the burden of actually refraining. Right? And what's and you have to be careful of this dynamic. We'll talk about this more. Actually, we'll talk about this after break, so don't worry about it. I'll muddy these waters. For the moment, right, we've got two burdens. The burdens of knowing to refrain, the burden of refraining. Okay? Now, we're going to get rid of DeLair very quickly. Well, actually, before I get rid of DeLair, Caitlin, Gulf refining, positivist realist. Is foreseeability a function of math or a function of policy? Man, positivist realist.
Positive.
Those are the two possibilities.
Positive.
Positivist. I was going to say, if you have any questions, Courtney's got that down now.
No. Not yet.
That's all right. We'll be back right after break.
I don't doubt it.
I don't want you to get lonely. Okay, so anyway, so positivist. And now, Caitlin, what about DeLair? What happens in DeLair? That's okay. We'll figure it out. What happened? Who can tell me what happens in DeLair? All right, go ahead, Adrian.
There was an auto accident.
There was an auto accident.
The defendant tried to pass the plaintiff, and his left rear tire blew out.
Okay.
He swerved and struck the plaintiff, causing an accident.
And what was the duty that the court said he had, that the defendant had, that he breached here?
Knew that his tires.
He had a burden to refrain. He had a burden to refrain from driving on.
Bad tires.
How bad?
Very bad. They were almost falling apart.
That's exactly right. They were, in fact, you could see the thread, the fabric. There's no rubber on these tires. Okay? So the court's got to figure. Now the court could have looked at this and said, okay, burden of knowing to refrain. That's what the defendant tried to do. Hey, wait a minute. The burden of knowing to change my tires was huge, right? Reasonable person's not going to know that you need to change your tires just because the thread is shown through, right? And the burden of refraining, set of new tires, it's going to run me what? $800, right? It's a big burden. Plaintiff's life? Nothing. Tiny loss, right? And the court, Caitlin, where was I? Oh, it was Adrian. And the court says what? They do the probability burden loss thing? No, what did they say?
They said that he should have known.
Why?
Because he drove the car, or because people have a duty to know that.
Why?
The cars.
Why? Why do they have? You're exactly right. Why? Where are you in the case?
159
Yes, that's exactly right. 159, where?
Towards the bottom,
Second full paragraph. You're exactly right. Keep going.
the rule must be rigid if millions are, is that what
That works fine.
the rule must be rigid if millions are to drive these instrumentalities, which in a fraction of a second may become instruments of destruction to life and property.
Keep going.
There is no series of accidents more destructive or more terrifying in the use of automobiles than those which come from blowouts. The law requires drivers and owners of motor vehicles to know the condition of those parts, which are.
We are going to make you liable. We're going to say you have a duty. We're going to say you have a duty not to drive on defective tires because we want to make you liable, Adrian. Why?
Society,
How's that going to protect society?
because there won't be accidents.
Why? You mean I just say, oh, you're negligent if you don't change your tires and all of a sudden there's no accidents?
It'll make people want to refrain from.
That is exactly right. This was foreseeable because we were trying to do what? What to behavior?
To stop the behavior.
That's to stop the behavior. It's exactly right. DeLair decides foreseeability on the basis of what kind of argument, Adrian?
Social policy deterrence.
That's exactly right. Positivist or realist approach to foreseeability.
Realist.
That's exactly right. We're not crunching any algebra here. That's what the defendant wanted. I need an expert. I need somebody to testify on the plaintiff's got to bring somebody in. What is the actual probability of a tire blowing out in this situation? Right? What do people know about tires? What do they not know? He needs an expert to give us all the variables in the burden probability loss equation. The court said, no, he doesn't. As a matter of policy, as a matter of law, this is foreseeable because we're trying, Adrian, to do what? To deter people from driving on bad tires. Is Andrews right that this question of foreseeability is sometimes perceived as a question of policy? Good. Now, right, before you have time to think, because we have 4 minutes left before I have to leave, quick look at Vaughn versus Menlove. Vaughn versus Menlove. And we're not going to finish Vaughn, but I want you to get Vaughn on the table because that will give us a context for what's going to happen. Vaughn is not a foreseeability case. What is the argument by the defendant in Vaughn versus Menlove? You have to love this. Some people will do anything. Duran, some people will do anything to escape liability.
Wasn't that he wasn't smart enough?
That's right. You're holding me to what standard?
Smart person standard.
No, the reasonable person standard, right? And Duran, I should be being held to what standard?
Not that.
The reasonable what standard?
Not as.
Go ahead and say it. The reasonable stupid person standard. I am a stupid person. I should be held to the reasonable stupid person standard, and the court should be determining whether it was foreseeable to a reasonable stupid person. Right? Think about how this works. So we're back in algebra land. We're going to do burden, probability, and loss. And we do burden. And the court says the burden of knowing to refrain from stacking your hay that way is, Duran, what? Reasonable person would know to stack their hay differently or not know to stack their hay differently? Pardon? They would know that. Tiny, tiny burden. And the defendant says what? Oh no, that's the burden on the reasonable person. Duran, you've got to use what standard for me? The different one. Which one?
The reasonable stupid.
Yes, you got to use the reasonable stupid person standard. And when you use the reasonable stupid person standard, what happens to the burden of knowing to refrain from stacking my hay in this way?
Hypothetically, it would lessen or go away.
Pardon?
I said hypothetically, it would disappear.
No, what happens? I'm pretty stupid. I don't understand things like straw burns. It's beyond my imagination. So therefore, if I don't understand stuff like that, how hard is it for me to stack my hay differently?
It would be very hard.
Be very hard. What happens to the burden then? It gets higher. It gets huge. And when that burden gets huge, it's suddenly able to be what? Exactly. It suddenly can be probability and loss. That's what's going on, is the argument in Vaughn versus Menlove is up here on reasonable person. Do we use the reasonable person standard for stupid people, or do we modify it for the reasonable person who's stupid? And when you change it, Courtney, is changing the reasonable person going to change the probability? What's probability?
Likelihood.
It's the actual what?
Actual.
No, just like you said, it's
Math.
actual math likelihood. Does that change because I changed the reasonable person? No. Kaylee, does the loss change? No, it's the actual loss in the case, right? But when I change the reasonable person, what changes? The burden. Right? And what we're going to be doing for the next couple weeks when we get back from break is different groups of people are going to come to us and they're going to say, either because I'm really good or I'm really weak, we should change the reasonable person standard for my case. And we're going to have to watch, one, what traits cause that standard to get changed and what traits don't. And also, why? What arguments? Court in Vaughn versus Menlove decides not to modify for people who are stupid. Why? What are the arguments that persuade the court not to modify for people who are stupid? Okay, so when we reconvene, we will look at, who has their syllabus? Andy. Thank you. Okay, so our first night back, we will take a look. Actually, we'll double back and we will take a look again, take a little bit more of a look at Gulf Refin, just to make sure that we're on the right track there. And no, change that. We're going to look at Vaughn in greater detail. We'll look at Vaughn, we'll look at Cordis and Roberts and Robinson. Wow, that'll be busy. Well, we may not finish, but you've got to look at them all together. No way around it, because there's going to be things that kind of interact with each other. And then for Thursday, we will take a look at Brunig, and we might do Brunig and Heath for Thursday. Brunig and Heath. Okay, if you're really industrious, we will not read Tarazoff and Zellmer. Okay, so don't read those over break and then be sad because we don't go in class. Okay, thank you all very much. Have a wonderful break. Even though mine will be very sad because I will be very lonely. Thank you very much. Those of you who aren't cynical about my feeling.